Indrani, especially on a topic of my personal.
Good evening, everybody. I thank the organizers for giving me this opportunity to speak in this August forum on low platelets and neuraxial anesthesia. Platelets play an important role in body's homeostatic mechanism. It is a well-known fact that pregnancy causes a lot of physiological alterations. They initiate hemostasis by aggregating at the site of injury and plug endothelial defects. Very low platelet is a very big concern to the obstetric anesthetist due to the risk involved in providing neuraxial anesthesia, especially when general anesthesia is also equally risky to the parturient. The hemostatic changes in pregnancy is tuned to manage the blood loss which is going to occur at the time of delivery and also to tackle minor coagulation issues. The blood becomes increasingly prothrombotic. That could be because of increased levels of fibrinogen, factor 7, 10, and 11, decreases in physiological anticoagulants such as antithrombin 3 and protein S. Hypofibrinolytic state produces a thrombophilic state at delivery. So if you look at the platelet count during uncomplicated pregnancy versus pregnancy with pre-existing disease, you will find that in the presence of pre-existing disease, the red line, you will find that the fall in platelet count is very, very significant as compared with women with uncomplicated pregnancies or women with pre-existing, pregnancy-related complications. So if there are pre-existing disorders, then the incidence of thrombocytopenia during pregnancy is much, much higher. So if you see this, graph, you will find this is a normal, non-pregnant female with a platelet count of 450,000. You will find that even during the first trimester, there is a fall, significant fall, and the fall continues throughout pregnancy till the time of delivery. So what is thrombocytopenia in pregnancy? It is defined as a platelet count, which is less than 150,000. And the most common diagnoses include gestational thrombocytopenia or immune thrombocytopenia. So what are the causes which have been postulated? One is hemodilutional effect of pregnancy, or because the spleen size is increased, so it starts trapping the thrombocytes, or maybe the intervillous spaces of the placenta starts trapping or accumulating the platelets, or it could be because of increased platelet consumption, and also because of accelerated clearance of thrombocytes, or increased platelet aggregation driven by increased levels of thromboxane A2. So other causes of maternal thrombocytopenia apart from gestational thrombocytopenia is hypertensive disorders, including preeclampsia, HELLP syndrome, acute fatty liver of pregnancy, or pregnancy-associated conditions, which is specific, is like thrombotic thrombocytopenic purpura, DIC, or hemolytic uremic syndrome. Non-pregnancy related is immune thrombocytopenia, or it could be hereditary because von Willebrand factor deficiency, or it could be because of drugs, hypersplenism, sepsis, ARDS, or most recently, what we have been seeing in COVID patients, presence of even viral infections such as COVID or dengue, malaria, all of them are known to produce significant thrombocytopenia. All of us have faced such patients, and apart from the multiple pathophysiological issues due to the COVID or dengue or malaria, thrombocytopenia can complicate the pregnancy. So what is the risk which we are looking at? The most important is the neuraxial anesthesia risk. And thrombocytopenia-related spinal hematoma. It is associated with the highest potential morbidity. If you compare a patient with the same low platelet count undergoing labor analgesia versus another patient who is undergoing knee arthroplasty, you will find that there is a 50-fold increase of likelihood of spinal epidural hematoma after epidural anesthesia for knee arthroplasties as compared to epidural labor analgesia. Some of the reasons postulated is also because of increase in fibrinogen, which is associated with pregnancy. And if you look at the incidence in the general obstetric population, it's 1 in 2 lakhs to 2.5 lakhs. Incidence based on platelet count, 70,000 to 1 lakh, about 0.2%, 50 to 70, 3%, and less than 50,000, hold your breath, it's about 11%. So most spinal epidural hematomas occurs at this range. This is a wonderful meta-analysis which was published as early as May 2020. And here they compared lumbar neuraxial procedures in thrombocytic and cytopenic patients, and they found out the incidence of spinal epidural hematoma. So this recent meta-analysis reported lumbar neuraxial procedures such as spinal epidural CSE or epidural catheter removal in thrombocytopenia patients, and they concluded that the spinal epidural hematoma is rare. So 33 cases of spinal epidural hematoma were identified from a total of 7,476 procedures between the years 1947 and 2018, most commonly after lumbar punctures with platelet counts less than 50,000. 5 cases of spinal epidural hematoma in obstetric patients with thrombocytopenia were reported. 1 in a patient was coagulopathic at the time of accidental epidural catheter removal, 1 who had an underlying spinal arteriovenous malformation, and 2 with HELLP syndrome, and 1 with eclampsia. So you know that confounding factors were more involved in the spinal epidural hematoma rather than the low platelet itself. The authors concluded that the sample probability of SCH formation for all neuraxial procedures is likely to be low and above an imprecise range of platelet count of more than 70 to 75,000. So what is the differential diagnosis for neuraxial hematoma? So it could be because of a physiologic or an iatrogenic disorder of the coagulation system. Patients can have liver disease, could be because of alcoholism, pharmacological anticoagulation, neoplasms, vascular malformation, vertebral hemangioma. In pregnant women, it has been proposed that increased venous pressure due to the uterine enlargement in association with the hemodynamic changes of pregnancy may predispose to rupture of pre-existing pathological epidural venous plexus, causing spinal epidural hematoma. So you may wonder, why are we paranoid about getting a neuraxial block and not general anesthesia? We all know that general anesthesia in labor has its own risks. The maternal risk is severe adverse events related to induction, failed tracheal intubation, severe hypertensive response to tracheal intubation, uterine atony, inability to provide neuraxial opioid for pain control, and the fetal problems could be respiratory depression, low upcurves, and limitation on immediate breastfeeding. So the symptoms which is generally seen following a neuraxial hematoma, the presentation is lower extremity motor deficit, back pain, lower extremity pain, paresthesia, urinary or bowel dysfunction, or sometimes even complete paraplegia. 95% present symptoms within 48 hours of procedure. Management is prompt imaging, neurosurgical consultation, and treatment with decompressive laminectomy within 8 hours of symptom onset. So what are the laboratory considerations? Which tests to perform? you have to do a CBC, you have to also do an absolute platelet count. So the false positives can be rarely because of low platelet count due to clumping induced by EDT. PT-PTT, it is performed if coagulation defect is known or suspected. For example, if you have a case of HELLP syndrome with a coagulation defect, then you have to perform PT-PTT. Or if the patient is on drugs, anticoagulants, you may have to do PT-PTT. There is no utility in predicting bleeding risk in pregnant patients with simple thrombocytopenia. Platelet aggregation studies is gold standard, but it is an expensive, time-consuming, so it may not be possible. Point of care assessments are there, such as platelet function analyzer and thromboelastography. Paradoxically, they are of value in thrombocytopenia, but take too long to organize and complete in an urgent clinical situation. Platelet function analyzer, it isolates other influence at work on the coagulation cascade. TEG is not affected by aspirin. It reflects most changes in hemostasis, including prothrombin and bleeding states. And we all know that the assessment of platelet function is in terms of clot strength for TEG because it takes into account the viscoelastic properties. Therefore, in a pregnant patient, fibrinogen levels are already high. So that has to be considered. So as you all know, as I just said, TEG and ROTEM, they are dynamic point of tests and evaluate properties of blood clots subjected to rotation. Insufficient evidence to recommend routine use to determine safety of neuraxial anesthesia in obstetric patients with thrombocytopenia, because the correlation which we find is quite poor. PFA, it evaluates platelet function by stimulating in vivo platelet plug formation. There is insufficient evidence to recommend routine use to determine safety of neuraxial anesthesia in obstetric patients with thrombocytopenia. Now coming to the recommendations when you have a patient with low platelets. So Society of Obstetrics, Obstetricians, that is SOAP, along with American Society of Regional Anesthesia and Pain Medicine, that is ASRA, ACOG, SMFM, and the American Society of Hematology. All of them have come together and have formulated guidelines for pregnant patients with low platelet counts. So these are the SOAP guidelines. If the patient has a known etiology of thrombocytopenia, for example, gestational thrombocytopenia, or if there is hypertensive disorder of pregnancy, along with concern for hemostasis disorder or DIC, it is reasonable to avoid neuraxial procedures. So even if the patient has 70,000 count, but has DIC, then please avoid neuraxial procedures. Platelets count of more than 70,000, it is reasonable to proceed with neuraxial procedures. So there isn't any cutoff which is supposed to be the best, but the recommendation is if the platelet counts are more than 70,000, it is reasonable to proceed with neuraxial procedures. If it is between 50 and 70, then there is a competing risk benefit which has to be considered, and for that you need to have a multidisciplinary team which has to discuss this out, and then you can go with the neuraxial procedure if needed. And it will also be dependent on the clinical setting. So what if is there a problem with giving general anesthesia in this patient? So if there is platelet count is less than 50,000, it's reasonable to avoid neuraxial procedures. And without known etaology of thrombocytopenia, with concern for hemostasis disorder or DIC, same thing. With or without known etiology, if there is hemostatic disorder or DIC, please avoid all neuraxial procedures. Platelet count of more than 70,000, even without history of or current bleeding, it's reasonable to proceed with neuraxial procedure, that is level 2, class 2A evidence, and platelet count of less than 70,000. Please do additional hematological workup and may be beneficial prior to proceeding with the neuraxial procedure, provided we don't even know the etiology of thrombocytopenia in these cases. Aspirin therapy in women with thrombocytopenia, there is insufficient evidence regarding neuraxial procedures in pregnant and postpartum women with thrombocytopenia were taking aspirin. While the half-life of aspirin is only 20 minutes, the lifetime of a platelet can be up to 10 days. However, hemostasis can be achieved with only 20% normal platelet Cox activity. So due to limited data, clinicians and patients should engage in shared decision-making about the perceived competing risk benefits of proceeding with or without withholding neuraxial anesthesia in cases of severe thrombocytopenia. Here, you have to mark the word severe thrombocytopenia. And when I said severe thrombocytopenia, I mean a platelet count of less than 50,000 and concurrent aspirin use. So what about the recommendation about lab testing in the presence of preeclampsia? So how early or how late you want the platelet count before putting the needle on the for giving spinal or epidural? There is again limited evidence. However, in the presence of HELP, the panel recommends that it may be reasonable to verify the platelet count within 6 hours of the planned neuraxial procedure, because it is a dynamic count, which is unstable. It's an unstable platelet count in HELP syndrome. So you at least 6 hours, within 6 hours, you should have the platelet count ready. Again, recommendations as to diagnostic assessment. How will you assess thrombocytopenia in pregnancy? First, have a good history, record any previous obstetric experience, whether they had it, neonatal blood counts, past response to treatments such as corticosteroids for immune thrombocytopenia, and family history of bleeding or autoimmune disorders. Physical examination, usually patients may be normal, but then if there are purpuric patches, please look out for it. And these are unusual unless the count is very low. Check the blood pressure in the presence of preeclampsia and for abdominal tenderness, and look out for HELP syndrome. Relevant laboratory tests depend on the stage of pregnancy and other factors. The one thing, at all stages, you have to repeat blood count, blood film to confirm thrombocytopenia, and urgently exclude presence of red cell fragments. Coagulation screen has to be done, and care in interpretation as APTT shortens during pregnancy. So consider checking autoimmune profile in selected cases. During second trimester onwards, you also have to do liver function and hemolysis screening. And postpartum, look for hemolytic uremic syndrome if there is a renal dysfunction, and family history of bleeding, thrombocytopenia, von Willebrand factor deficiency, and hereditary macrothrombopathies. All of them have to be tested. These are the patients who have to be assessed. Changes in white cell count in the presence or absence of lymphadenopathy, you have to consider a bone marrow. But remember that there is a left shift in white cell series in normal pregnancy. What about platelet count and epidural hematoma? As I already said, it is a rare complication. There is only a single report of an epidural hematoma in pregnant women occurring in the presence of thrombocytopenia. Very low platelet counts has risk of hemorrhage because of the collection within the bony confines of the spine, leading to paraplegia as a result of cord compression from a spinal hematoma following regional blockade. The debate regarding the safety of neuraxial blockade in women with thrombocytopenia is never going to be addressed by a clinical trial. And for the foreseeable future, clinical practice will be guided by expert consensus opinion. So platelet count, when it is low, you can provide neuraxial block provided the low count is clearly stable, maternal health is good, normal fibrinogen levels, INR and APTT are there. Expert opinion is that neuraxial blockade can be justified provided the platelet count is 50,000 or above. Such situation should not be regarded as routine. and are for skilled and experienced anesthetists. And two relatively common conditions that meet these criteria are gestational thrombocytopenia and immune thrombocytopenia. So in preeclampsia and HELP, there is low-grade activation of coagulation, increasing the risk of venous thromboembolism in an already prothrombotic pregnant circulation. And in these patients, the patients get thrombocytopenia because of consumption coagulopathy. Consumption is greater than activation, and the platelet count and or other hemostatic variables may become depleted, and hence there is widespread coagulopathy. There's abnormalities in the coagulation screen, a falling platelet count below 75,000 that is clearly unstable, and poor maternal health militate towards a more cautious approach. So patients assessed on their merits, weighing up the risks of epidural hematoma against the desirability of regional anesthesia or the undesirability of general anesthesia. As I already said, if there is a problem with giving general anesthesia, or if there is a risk, higher risk of giving general anesthesia, only then you have to look into the desirability of giving regional anesthesia in these patients with low platelet count. So if you are indeed giving neuraxial anesthesia in these patients with low platelet count, please start using smaller needles. Needle trauma is proportional to needle gauge, and however, there's lack of data. So to compare the risk of spinal hematoma for epidural versus spinal, but consensus is that spinal needles are safer because they are smaller. Also, you can look into the epidural catheter design, which is less traumatic. So nowadays we have available in nylon with intermediate bending stiffness and which is more flexible, wire reinforced versions, which is available in nylon or polyurethane coating. This is also made in single end hole or multiple orifice designs. Some traditional nylon catheters have flexible tips to minimize risks than with stiffer catheters. There is lower incidence of epidural vein cannulation, paresthesia, catheter migration, and even incidence of spinal hematoma has not been studied. So we assume that the incidence of spinal hematoma is less if you're using such safe epidural catheter designs. And wire reinforced catheters have limited MRI compatibility. That you should keep in your mind, which may be important because the obstetric patients require MRI post-peripartum neurological evaluation. So once you have a low platelet count, now you have to manipulate the low platelet count by giving platelet transfusions. So how and when will you give? If operative delivery is planned, transfusion should be explored with the anesthetic, obstetric, and hematology teams when the count is below 75,000. If vaginal delivery is planned, a lower threshold of 50,000 applies. In an emergency, an alternative approach is to use desmopressin, which promotes platelet activation in dose of 0.3 microgram per kilogram IV over 30 minutes. And it works within 30 minutes and is effective for hours. And because it causes ADH secretion, it can lead to water retention, and care must be exercised in pre-eclamptic receiving IV fluids. This is associated with an increased rate of thrombosis. So the risks of platelet transfusion reaction, circulatory overload, and acute lung injury. The expected increase is 30,000 to 50,000 after apheresis derived bag of platelets, less effective in preeclampsia or consumption disorders. Platelet transfusions are recommended for life-threatening hemorrhage in preparation for urgent surgery. And there is lack of evidence regarding efficacy. A Cochrane review assessed the benefit of platelet transfusion prior to neuraxial anesthesia, concluded that no evidence from RCTs or non-randomized studies on which to base an assessment of the correct platelet transfusion threshold prior to insertion of a lumbar puncture needle or an epidural catheter. Well, even if there are no RCTs, we still have these recommendations in place. So if you are looking at a patient who is having a low platelet count, but the maternal health is good, and normal fibrinogen levels and INR and APTT, you can go ahead and put in an epidural in these patients with a platelet count of 50,000. So that is what we have come to a conclusion with all the recommendations of SOAP and other guidelines. Thank you very much.
Good evening, everybody. I'm Dr. Renu Vaklu, and I'll be speaking on anesthesia challenges for laparoscopic surgeries during pregnancy. Coming to the indications of laparoscopy during pregnancy, approximately 1 to 2% patients will require non-obstetric surgery, of which the most commonest cause is acute appendicitis, then cholecystitis, acute abdomen where the etiology is not clear. The other causes are the adnexal torsion, ovarian cyst, symptomatic myomas, adrenal tumors, and trauma, to name a few. Timing of the non-obstetric surgery is important. Ideally, elective surgery should be delayed till 6 weeks after pregnancy. Avoid surgery in the first trimester if possible to avoid the risk of abortions. The most optimal time is the second trimester when organogenesis is complete and there is low risk of preterm labor. However, recent literature demonstrates that surgery can be done in any trimester without an increase in the fetal risk, with increase in the competence of the surgeons. There is no increase in fetal demise with antepartum lap choles. Rather, it avoids recurrent symptoms, recurrent hospitalizations, and the consequences. So the benefits of laparoscopy during pregnancy are that you have a small wound with less postoperative pain, less postoperative ileus, decreased requirement of narcotics postoperatively with decreased effect on the fetus. There is decrease in the risk of thromboembolism and decreased length of stay in the hospital. Therefore, for a safe conduct of anesthesia in pregnancy, what is required is an understanding of the maternal and fetal physiology, understanding of the altered drug pharmacology, proper counseling to the patient, and ideally surgery to be done at an institution with neonatal, pediatric, and obstetric services. The potential concerns are maternal safety, the effect of the physiological changes of pregnancy on the management, maintenance of the uteroplacental physiology, the effects of positioning, the risk of abortion and fetal demise and teratogenicity in the first trimester, the concern for aspiration prophylaxis second trimester onwards, the risk of preterm labor in the third trimester, then safety profile of the antibiotic to be used, and the dose adjustment. The hemodynamic and the respiratory changes that we encounter are because of the increase in the intra-abdominal pressure, because of the absorption of the insufflating gas, and because of the effect of position, Trendelenburg or reverse Trendelenburg. The two components of carbon dioxide insufflation, that is the increased intra-abdominal pressure and increased carbon dioxide, elicit certain effects. The increased intra-abdominal pressure elicits a neurohumoral response with an increase in norepinephrine, epinephrine, vasopressin, and aldosterone levels. The mechanical effects are because of the compression of the IVC, where there is pooling of the blood with fall in the preload. The aortic compression with its effect on the afterload, increased SVR, increased mean arterial pressure, and a fall in the cardiac output. Then there is fall in the splanchnic blood flow, fall in the renal blood flow with consequent increase in the renin and increase in the mean arterial pressure. Then the mechanical effect on the diaphragm causes it to be dislocated upwards with increase in the airway pressure, fall in the compliance, fall in the FRC, making these patients more prone to hypoxia during apnea. Now, increase in the carbon dioxide causes an increase in the pulmonary arterial pressure, pulmonary vasoconstriction, arrhythmias, and there is an entity of subcutaneous emphysema which should be kept in mind in these patients, which has an incidence of around 0.5 to 1.5% secondary to extravasation of the gas, and to be suspected if the EtCO2 starts rising after it has plateaued, or the rise in EtCO2 is more than 50 after 30 minutes of surgery. The risk factors are prolonged surgery more than 3.5 hours, increase in the intra-abdominal pressure to more than 15, disruption of the facial planes, or if the surgeon is using high gas flow rates. The effect of the positioning of the patient, mainly it is the hemodynamic effects of the Trendelenburg and the reverse Trendelenburg position, which have opposite effects on the right atrial pressure, the pulmonary capillary wedge pressure, and the cardiac output. And these effects are accentuated if hypovolemia is there. So the goal of management is to cause a minimal alteration in the maternal physiology, optimize the uteroplacental perfusion, optimize the oxygenation of the maternal blood, avoid the drugs which are contraindicated in pregnancy, prevent premature uterine contractions, and avoid 5Hs. 5H. These 5Hs are more dangerous than any other teratogenic drug. Rather, I would say they are more teratogenic. Number one is hypoxia, hypocarbia, hypercarbia, hypothermia, and hypotension. Hypoxia causes uterine vasoconstriction with, of course, respiratory acidosis. Hypocarbia, which you induce by hyperventilation, will cause respiratory alkalosis and left shift of the oxyhemoglobin curve. Then hypotension from aortocaval compression or the effect of anesthetic agents will reduce the fetal blood flow, and that should be immediately treated with IV fluids, vasopressors, blood products, and adjustment of ventilation and position as and when and what is deemed necessary. Then treat hypothermia. Then hypercarbia. Hypercarbia is cause myocardial depression and fetal acidosis. And we have to avoid excessive positive pressure ventilation because it increases the intrathoracic pressure and reduces the venous return. Now, coming to the issues approved by the American Society of Anesthesiologists and American College of Obstetricians, they say that no anesthetic agent except cocaine in normal clinical doses has been proven to be teratogenic in humans, and no anesthetic agent has been proven to induce preterm labor or delivery. So for teratogenicity, the timing of exposure is crucial because first to 15 days of gestation is important, where an all or nothing phenomena occurs. So embryo is either lost or is preserved. And for major congenital malformations, they most likely occur from exposure between day 15 to day 60. Though it is not possible from these studies to conclude that if any major malformation has occurred, is it related to the anesthetic agent, is it related to the surgery or the condition that compels surgery. The FDA category ratings during pregnancies, they have categorized the drugs. Category A, where the control studies demonstrate no risk, you have paracetamol in this group. Category B, there's no evidence of risk in humans. Category C, where the risk cannot be ruled out. Category D is drugs where there is a potential evidence of risk. And category X is drugs which are totally contraindicated in pregnancy. For example, thalidomide. Now, according to FDA category ratings again, all IV induction agents, volatile agents, neuromuscular blockers, opioids, and local anesthetics, they belong to category B or C. Therefore, you can use them. Now, regarding benzodiazepines, they have been classified by FDA as category D. Based on retrospective surveys finding association between diazepam and cleft lip and palate. However, large prospective studies have not found such an association, and there is no data to show that a single dose during anesthesia is harmful. You've got to weigh the risk and benefits when deciding about their use. With nitrous oxide, 50% nitrous oxide has weak teratogenic effect in rodents. The sympathetic stimulation it causes decreases the uterine blood flow, and that has been implicated in teratogenicity, and that too when it is used for more than 24 hours. The current evidence does not support withholding nitrous oxide in clinical practice. In fact, administration of nitrous with volatile agents prevents teratogenic effects. Now, coming to the pre-anesthetic preparation, it requires evaluation, counseling, and reassurance in the same manner as in non-pregnant patients, taking into account the risk of aspiration, difficult intubation, and risk to the fetus. Routine investigations, adequate arrangement for blood, as for any other major surgical intervention, consultation with the obstetrician and documentation of the presence of fetal heart rate and discussion about the use of tocolytics is a must. overnight fasting with standard fasting regime of 6 to 8 hours, depending on the type of food. Then aspiration prophylaxis with H2 receptor antagonist and non-particulate antacid is must after 18 weeks or before that also if patient has symptomatic GERD. Then OT preparation is the same, the drugs, machine, difficult airway cart, suction and monitors, and a judicious pre-op anxiolysis with a small dose titrated to effect. If you think it is necessary, absolutely necessary, go ahead, absolutely. Now coming to the anesthetic management, maternal monitoring, again blood pressure, the same electrocardiography, pulse oximetry, capnography, temperature monitoring. And for the fetus, you can use an external Doppler device for fetal heart rate and a tocodynamometer to measure the uterine contractility. The intraoperative fetal monitoring, the decision is made collaboratively with the obstetrician and is technically possible after 18 weeks. The site of the surgery may make it difficult, so you can use sterile ultrasound probes. And it requires the presence of a person who is trained in interpreting fetal heart rate, because loss of fetal heart rate variability is not always an indicator of fetal distress. It could be an effect of anesthetic agents or gases or drugs you're using. Therefore, you need a person who is trained in interpreting the fetal heart rate, and usually they are the nurses from the labor room. General anesthesia, again pre-oxygenation, rapid sequence induction, cricoid pressure, tracheal intubation using cuffed endotracheal tube. Ketamine increases uterine tone in early pregnancy and therefore to be avoided. But if you have to use it, the dose should be restricted to less than 1 milligram per kg. And once the airway is secured, ventilation should aim to keep the PaCO2 in the normal range of pregnancy, maintaining a mild respiratory alkalosis. Maintain left uterine displacement throughout to prevent aortocabal compression, and muscle relaxant, an opioid or a moderate concentration of inhalational agent, less than 1.5 Mac with high concentration of oxygen is recommended, and the use of nitrous oxide should be limited during long operations in the first trimester by giving high concentration of oxygen. And guidelines issued by the Society of American Gastrointestinal Endoscopic Surgeons during pregnancy say that they should use an open technique to enter the abdomen, monitor the maternal end-tidal carbon dioxide and keep it around 30 to 30 millimeters of mercury range, maintain a low pneumoperitoneum pressure less than 12 and never exceeding 15 mm, limit the extent of Trendelenburg or reverse Trendelenburg position, because positioning during anesthesia should be slow, as a change in position can have a profound hemodynamic effect. Avoid light anesthesia to prevent maternal catecholamine release, which will which will cause a decrease in the uteroplacental flow. To ensure the fetal well-being, it is important to avoid a fall in the uterine blood flow because uterine circulation is not autoregulated. And as I mentioned earlier, avoid 5 H's, hypoxia, hypocarbia, hypotension, hypothermia, and hypercarbia. And patients on magnesium for tocolysis, you need to reduce the dose of neuromuscular blockers, and the reversal agent should be given slowly because increased release of acetylcholine will increase the uterine tone and may cause preterm labor. And atropine should be preferred to glycopyrrolate to antagonize the muscarinic effects of neostigmine, because like neostigmine, atropine also crosses the placental barrier. Now, after desufflation, maintain mechanical ventilation for some time to wash out the carbon dioxide which is stored in the body and extubate when fully awake after the return of protective airway reflexes. Post-operatively, monitor the fetal heart rate, uterine activity, detect any preterm labor, and adequate analgesia is must because catecholamine pain will cause catecholamine release. Therefore, regional analgesia may be preferable, but if you got to give IV, then paracetamol is the agent of choice because it is category A. When you want to use opioid with low potency, tramadol or buprenorphine are agents of choice. Avoid NSAIDs, especially after 32 weeks, as it may cause premature closure of ductus and may predispose the patient to oligohydramnios. Now, because we know pregnancy is a hypercoagulable state, therefore you need to give prophylaxis against thromboembolic evidence. The incidence of DVT is 0.1 to 0.2. So pneumatic compression devices, heparin, low molecular weight heparin agents of choice, and very important to ambulate the patient post-operatively. Thank you.